Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
What if real intimacy does not calm the divine masculine at first? What if it actually unsettles him? Not because he does not care, not because the connection is false, but because real intimacy reaches places in his mind that performance can no longer protect. It touches the thoughts he hides behind silence, the fears buried beneath control, the longing beneath detachment, the pressure he feels to stay strong, unreadable, untouched. And suddenly, the man who seemed so composed begins fighting battles no one else can see. Why does he overthink after real closeness? Why does he pull back when he feels too much? Why does one honest connection stay in his mind longer than 10 shallow ones ever could? Why does being truly understood feel both healing and terrifying? Because real intimacy does not just enter his heart. It enters his mind. It rearranges his thoughts. It exposes his contradictions. It breaks his old emotional defenses. And if he cannot escape what it reveals, it begins to transform him. In this video, we are going to uncover what real intimacy actually does to the divine masculine mind, how it disrupts his inner world, why it often makes him appear more conflicted before he becomes more clear, and why the very intimacy that shakes him may be the thing that finally wakes him up. Chapter 1. Why real intimacy feels so different to him. There is a kind of closeness that a man can enjoy without ever being changed by it. He can enjoy attraction. He can enjoy attention. He can enjoy chemistry, desire, tension, admiration, the thrill of being wanted, the ego rush of feeling chosen. He can move through all of that and still remain essentially untouched. Not because those experiences mean nothing, but because many of them can stay on the surface. They can stimulate him without exposing him, excite him without transforming him, pull him in without forcing him to confront what lives underneath his carefully managed exterior. But real intimacy is different. It does not stay on the surface. It does not merely make him feel something. It makes him meet something. And that is why real intimacy feels so different to the divine masculine mind. Because the moment intimacy becomes real, it stops being a pleasant emotional experience he can categorize and control. It becomes a force that enters the deeper chambers of his inner world. It touches his thoughts, his identity, his fears, his self-protective patterns, his longing, his old wounds, his need for control, and the fragile places beneath the strength he shows the world. This is why a man can look calm on the outside and feel completely rearranged within. He may not understand it at first. He may not even have language for it. But something in him knows that real intimacy is not like ordinary connection. It is heavier, softer, more dangerous, more sacred. Because real intimacy does not only ask, "Do you feel something?" It asks, "What happens to you when what you feel becomes too real to hide from?" That is the question that changes everything. Many people misunderstand the divine masculine because they judge him only by outer behavior. If he goes quiet, they assume he feels nothing. If he becomes conflicted, they assume the connection was never deep. If he withdraws, they assume the bond was only shallow attraction. But often the opposite can be true. Sometimes the deeper the intimacy, the more internally disruptive it becomes at first. Not because he is incapable of love, not because the connection is false, but because real intimacy penetrates the exact places where he has built mental and emotional defenses. A man can survive a lot while staying mentally compartmentalized. He can go to work, lead, perform, achieve, stay disciplined, stay composed, look grounded, speak with certainty, carry himself with strength. And all the while, there can still be regions inside him he has not truly entered. Regions of tenderness, regions of grief, regions of fear, regions of unmet longing, regions of emotional hunger he has learned to rename as independence, regions of vulnerability he has hidden beneath ambition, distance, or control. Then real intimacy arrives. And somehow, without shouting, without forcing, without breaking the door down, it enters those regions. That is why it feels different. It does not behave like entertainment. It behaves like revelation. At first, he may think it is just attraction. Just one more strong connection. Just chemistry. Just emotional resonance. Just one more person who somehow feels easy to talk to, hard to forget, strangely familiar. But then he notices that this is not leaving him the way other experiences do. He thinks about the connection after it is over. He replays small moments. He remembers certain words, certain silences, certain looks. He feels strangely affected by things that should not matter so much. He senses an emotional pressure building in places he usually keeps sealed. That is when the divine masculine mind begins to realize that real intimacy is not something he can reduce to a label. Because labels are a form of control. If he can call it chemistry, he can keep it light. If he can call it attraction, he can stay powerful. If he can call it complicated, he can delay. If he can call it bad timing, he can avoid the deeper question. But real intimacy resists being reduced. It keeps living in him. It survives the conversation. It survives the moment. It survives physical absence. It survives his attempts to act normal. And that persistence is what begins unsettling him. Because now he is not only dealing with another person. He is dealing with his own mind in a way he is not used to. Why is he thinking this much? Why is one honest interaction echoing louder than so many shallow ones? Why does this person stay in his mental space when he would rather return to emotional order? Why does real closeness create so much inner noise before it creates peace? The answer is simple, though not easy. Because real intimacy goes where his ordinary defenses cannot fully follow. A man can defend against surface attraction with style, rhythm, distance, and charm. He can regulate how much he texts, how much he reveals, how much access another person gets, how vulnerable he appears, how much emotional advantage he preserves. But real intimacy changes the game. Once a connection becomes emotionally real, those outer strategies stop solving the deeper disturbance. He may still use them, of course. He may still pull back, slow down, think harder, become more careful, more restrained, more inward. But none of those things remove the fact that something in him has already been touched. That is the difference. Real intimacy does not just create emotion. It creates contact with self. This is why it often feels so mentally consuming to the divine masculine. The connection is no longer happening only between him and the other person. It is also happening between him and all the parts of himself that intimacy is now illuminating. His fear of being known, his fear of losing control, his fear of needing too much, his fear of being affected beyond what his masculine identity knows how to permit, his fear that if he lets this become fully real, he will have to stop performing strength and start embodying truth. And truth is much more demanding. Performance says, stay composed. Truth says, why are you so shaken? Performance says, keep the upper hand. Truth says, why do you need the upper hand at all? Performance says, do not reveal too much. Truth says, what are you protecting so fiercely? Performance says, you are fine. Truth says, then why does this linger in your mind like a question you cannot put down? This is why real intimacy feels spiritually weighty. Because it does not merely enter his emotional world. It interrogates the structure of his mind. The divine masculine mind, especially when still partially asleep, often depends on organization through control. Not always obvious control. Sometimes subtle control. control through restraint, through silence, through delay, through self-containment, through mental categorization, through staying one step removed from whatever could emotionally undo him. Then real intimacy appears and refuses to stay in its assigned box. That refusal creates tension. He may begin overthinking, not because the connection is small, but because it is too large to fit inside the mental system he has used to make life feel manageable. He may analyze every interaction, question meanings, replay conversations, notice shifts in tone, feel haunted by silences, try to understand what exactly is happening to him. This is not always romantic fantasy. Sometimes it is his nervous system trying to process a level of emotional reality that his old defenses were never designed to hold gracefully. And that is why he may look more conflicted before he looks more clear. This is one of the most misunderstood parts of real intimacy. People imagine that if a connection is true, it will make everything immediately simpler. Sometimes, eventually, it does. But first, it often reveals how much complexity already existed inside him. The confusion is not always caused by intimacy. Intimacy often exposes confusion that was already there. Confusion about love, about masculinity, about vulnerability, about what strength actually is, about what he wants versus what he can currently sustain, about whether his old identity can survive the level of openness this connection is inviting. That is why real intimacy can feel like a mental storm. Not because it is wrong, because it is real. And reality is disruptive when a man has been living through adaptation. For years, he may have mastered a version of himself that functions well in the world. He knows how to think strategically. He knows how to contain emotion. He knows how to stay useful, effective, admired, and difficult to destabilize. Then he experiences real intimacy, and suddenly he realizes that effectiveness is not the same as emotional freedom. He realizes he can be competent and still guarded, respected and still lonely, desired and still disconnected, strong and still frightened by what happens when someone comes close enough to matter. This realization is painful, but sacred. Because now the mind can no longer keep pretending that all is well simply because all is controlled. Real intimacy breaks that illusion. It shows him that some of his mental patterns were not wisdom. They were survival. Some of his boundaries were not clarity. They were fear. Some of his calm was not peace. It was distance. Some of his self-possession was not freedom. It was the avoidance of being deeply touched. And once a man begins to see that, he stands at the edge of awakening. That is why this chapter matters. Before the divine masculine changes outwardly, something has to happen inwardly. His mind has to be disturbed by a form of intimacy that it cannot easily dismiss, flatten, or dominate. He has to come into contact with a closeness that feels different enough to make the old categories collapse. Not because collapse is the goal, because honesty is. Real intimacy feels different to him because it does not flatter the mask. It bypasses it. It enters where he is still unformed. It reveals where he is still divided. It confronts him with the difference between the man he appears to be and the man he becomes when closeness reaches the places he has hidden from himself. And that confrontation, though uncomfortable, is holy. Because the divine masculine is not awakened by shallow comfort. He is awakened when something real touches his mind deeply enough that he can no longer live unconsciously inside the same old patterns. That is what real intimacy does. It gets past the image. It gets past the script. It gets past the charming version of strength. And once it does, the man who thought he was simply experiencing connection realizes he is actually standing inside the beginning of transformation. That is why it feels so different. Because it is. Chapter 2. Real intimacy bypasses the mask. Every man has a version of himself he learned to show the world. Sometimes that version looks strong, sometimes calm, sometimes disciplined, mysterious, independent, emotionally steady, hard to read, impossible to shake. And in many ways, that version is real. It is not always fake. It is often a survival structure, built over years, built through disappointment, built through pride, built through pain, built through the quiet education of learning what earns respect and what gets exposed. So he learns. He learns how to speak without revealing too much, how to care without looking needy, how to desire without confessing depth, how to stay composed even when something unsettles him, how to keep one part of himself guarded, even in moments of connection. This is the mask, not necessarily a lie, more often a protection, a carefully shaped outer identity that lets him function, lead, attract, perform, and survive without having to place his deepest emotional reality fully in someone else's hands. And for a long time, it works. It helps him move through life with a sense of control. It gives him structure. It gives him distance from the softer places. It lets him feel powerful, or at least protected from being obviously powerless. But real intimacy does something almost nothing else can do. It bypasses the mask. Not by force, not by argument, not by pressure, by contact. That is what makes it so unsettling to the divine masculine mind. Real intimacy does not simply ask him to open up. It reaches the places behind the outer identity before he has even fully decided whether he wants it to. A woman may say very little and still disrupt him. A quiet moment may affect him more than a dramatic one. A simple emotional truth may linger in his thoughts longer than any flirtation ever did. Why? Because the mind can manage appearances. Real intimacy interacts with what appearance was hiding. That is the difference. A man can wear the mask in many kinds of connection. He can be attractive inside it, successful inside it, confident inside it, desired inside it, even admired for what looks like depth, when in reality much of that depth is just distance wrapped in calm language. But once intimacy becomes real, the mask starts losing its power. Because real intimacy does not only respond to the image, it responds to the undercurrent, to the tension beneath his composure, to the sadness behind the confidence, to the emotional caution beneath the self-control, to the hidden ache beneath the strength. And that is where things start to change. At first, he may not understand why this connection feels different, why this person's presence gets into his head, why her silence feels louder than other people's words, why he starts thinking about things he normally keeps neatly buried beneath routine, ambition, or restraint. But the reason is simple. Something has moved past the surface. And once something moves past the surface, the masculine mind often becomes more conflicted before it becomes more clear. Because the mask was never only about image. It was about regulation. It was how he stayed stable, how he prevented himself from feeling too much too quickly, how he controlled access, how he kept the deeper chambers of himself from being entered too easily. Then real intimacy enters anyway. And now the old system does not work the same way. He may still try to use it. He may go quiet, pull back a little, become more thoughtful, more reserved, more controlled in his communication, more analytical about the connection. But all of that starts to feel less effective because the real issue is no longer outside him. The real issue is that the mask has been bypassed, and what lies behind it is now awake. This is one of the most important things to understand about the divine masculine mind. When he feels deeply affected, he does not always show it in obvious ways. Sometimes the deeper the effect, the more he retreats inward to understand what is happening. Not because nothing is there, because too much is. That is what real intimacy does. It moves him from performance into inner confrontation. A man may believe he is simply being careful, but underneath, something else may be happening. He is realizing that his usual ways of staying safe are no longer enough. He cannot charm his way out of being seen. He cannot think his way out of being affected. He cannot stay entirely self-contained once emotional reality has begun living inside him. That can feel almost threatening, because when the mask stops working, the mind loses a familiar form of control. And the mind does not like losing control, especially when the identity has been built around it. He may start noticing contradictions in himself. He wants closeness, but suddenly becomes distant. He feels understood, but then becomes guarded. He wants more contact, but also feels the urge to slow everything down. He thinks about her constantly, but says less. He feels emotionally stirred, but tries to return to logic. This is not random. It is the mind trying to negotiate with the reality the mask can no longer fully manage. One part of him wants to stay in the known structure. The role, the image, the version of masculinity that knows how to remain composed and unreadable. Another part is being drawn into something more real, something softer, something riskier, something that does not ask him merely to be impressive, but to be emotionally present. And emotional presence is harder than performance. Performance has lines. It has rules. It has posture. It has strategies. It gives a man a script. Presence has no script. Presence asks him to remain in the moment without hiding behind a role. To be touched without immediately turning that experience into defense. To let someone matter without needing to dominate the meaning of that mattering. That is why intimacy bypassing the mask feels so destabilizing. It is not only that he likes her. It is not only that he feels chemistry. It is that the parts of him he usually uses to stay protected are no longer enough to keep his deeper self out of the experience. Now the deeper self is in the room. The part that longs. The part that fears. The part that wonders whether it is safe to be known. The part that wants to surrender, but does not yet know how. The part that still associates emotional exposure with danger. The part that has spent years learning how to stay strong by staying partially unavailable. This is why one real connection can affect him more than many shallow ones ever did. Shallow interactions leave the mask intact. Real intimacy meets the man underneath. And when that happens, he can no longer fully enjoy the old way of being with the same innocence. He starts noticing how much energy went into being fine. How much of his calm depended on not being touched deeply. How much of his masculine identity depended on control, self-containment, and emotional distance. That realization can be humbling, because the mask often feels like selfhood. He may say, "This is just who I am." But intimacy begins asking a sharper question. Is it really who you are? Or is it who you became to survive being hurt? That question can echo inside a man for a long time. Because if the answer is the second one, then something even deeper becomes clear. The version of masculinity he trusted may not be false in every way, but it may be incomplete. It may have kept him protected, while also keeping him partially asleep. That is why real intimacy is such a sacred force. It does not merely bring comfort. It reveals incompleteness. Not to shame him, to awaken him. A woman who bypasses the mask is not necessarily doing anything dramatic. She may simply be emotionally congruent, present, perceptive, honest in a way that does not let him stay split forever. She may sense his hesitation without needing him to explain it. She may feel the gap between his words and his energy. She may look at him in a way that makes him feel transparent. She may say one thing that lands with unsettling accuracy. And suddenly, he realizes he is not being met at the level of the role. He is being met at the level of the truth beneath it. This can feel deeply relieving and deeply frightening. Relieving, because part of every man wants to stop performing, wants to be known, wants to be loved beyond utility, beyond image, beyond the endless effort of having to appear solid all the time. Frightening, because if he is known beyond the mask, then he can no longer depend on the mask as fully as he used to. Now he must decide whether he will retreat deeper into it, or begin loosening his grip on it. That is where real transformation starts. Not when he gives some perfect speech. Not when he suddenly becomes emotionally fluent overnight. But when he begins to recognize that the old version of strength is no longer enough for the kind of intimacy his soul is now encountering. This is why the divine masculine mind often becomes so active after real closeness. Because once the mask is bypassed, the mind starts trying to understand what the soul has already felt. It replays moments, analyzes words, questions his own reactions, tries to make sense of why this one person, this one tone, this one conversation, this one silence carries so much weight. The answer is not always romantic fantasy. Sometimes the answer is that truth got through. Truth about how defended he has been. Truth about how much he wants to be understood. Truth about how much fear still sits beneath his control. Truth about how exhausting it has been to live behind a version of masculinity that keeps him protected, but not fully alive. That is why this chapter matters. Real intimacy feels different because it does not stay politely outside the boundaries of the identity he built. It moves past the outer layer. It reaches what is hidden. It meets what is wounded. It touches what is real. And once what is real has been touched, the mask starts to feel heavier. Still usable, perhaps. Still familiar. Still tempting in moments of fear. But heavier. Because now he knows it is there. And now he knows something else is possible. A masculinity that is not built on unreadability. A strength that does not depend on emotional distance. A presence that does not require performance. A mind that no longer needs constant control in order to feel safe. That is the beginning of awakening. The mask is bypassed. The deeper self is touched. The mind becomes unsettled. And the man who once thought he was simply feeling attraction begins to realize that what is really happening is far more serious. He is being invited out of the identity that protected him, and into the truth that can finally transform him. Chapter 3. It makes him think about what he usually avoids. There are thoughts a man can outrun for years. Not because they are small, but because he has become skilled at staying busy enough, disciplined enough, distracted enough, admired enough, or emotionally controlled enough to avoid sitting still with them for too long. He can work, achieve, lead, provide, plan, perform, desire, pursue, recover, move on, keep going. And while he is moving, many questions remain quiet. Questions about love. Questions about vulnerability. Questions about whether the life he has built is actually connected to who he really is. Questions about whether his strength is whole or merely efficient. Questions about whether his peace is real or simply the absence of emotional exposure. These questions do not disappear. They wait. They wait behind routine, behind ambition, behind silence, behind all the places a man learns to hide from his own interior. Then real intimacy enters. And suddenly, the questions he usually avoids start thinking through him. That is one of the deepest things real intimacy does to the divine masculine mind. It brings him face to face with thoughts he can no longer keep buried beneath function. It does not only make him feel differently, it makes him think differently, and often against his own will. This is why one authentic connection can affect him more than years of surface interaction ever could. Because shallow connection lets him remain mentally compartmentalized. Real intimacy breaks the compartments. Before, he could keep life organized. One part for work, one part for goals, one part for attraction, one part for emotion, perhaps, but only in measured doses. He could decide what belonged where. He could keep deep questions in the background, because nothing was pressing hard enough on the deeper layers of his psyche to force them forward. But when intimacy becomes real, the background moves to the front. He starts replaying conversations, re-examining silences, remembering little details that would normally pass unnoticed, thinking about what he said, what he did not say, what she meant, what he felt, why it lingers, why it matters. And most unsettling of all, he begins thinking about himself. Not the polished version, the hidden one, the one he usually avoids meeting directly. This is where the real disruption starts. Because the divine masculine mind often prides itself on control through clarity. He likes to understand, to categorize, to hold structure, to remain mentally ahead of what threatens to make him emotionally vulnerable. He may tolerate mystery in life, but usually only to the extent that it does not destabilize the version of himself he trusts. Then intimacy introduces a form of inner uncertainty he cannot easily master. He starts asking questions he did not want to ask. Why did that moment affect me so deeply? Why do I keep thinking about her when I have no reason to be this affected? Why did one honest conversation enter me more than 100 shallow exchanges? Why do I feel both drawn and cautious at the same time? Why am I suddenly thinking about love, loss, truth, timing, and responsibility in ways I usually keep at a distance? These are not casual thoughts. They carry weight. Because what real intimacy does is awaken contemplation in a man who may have built much of his life around controlled momentum. Momentum says, keep moving. Intimacy says, stop. Look. Momentum says, focus on what's practical. Intimacy says, what are you actually feeling beneath what is practical? Momentum says, stay effective. Intimacy says, are you alive inside your own effectiveness? This is what makes real intimacy so mentally disruptive. It turns a man inward, often before he knows how to meet himself there with peace. He may suddenly find that he cannot merely enjoy the connection. He has to interpret it. He has to sit with it. He has to wonder what it means. Not only what it means about the other person, but what it means about him. And for a man who has spent years avoiding deeper self-examination, this can feel almost invasive. Because now the mind is no longer serving only function. It is serving revelation. He may begin thinking about things he usually avoids because those things are no longer abstract. Love is no longer a concept. It is a risk. Loss is no longer a theory. It is a possibility. Responsibility is no longer a moral idea. It is the question of who he becomes when someone truly matters. Vulnerability is no longer a poetic word. It is the felt experience of realizing that another person's presence can affect his mental world in ways he cannot command. This is why intimacy makes him think. Not in the shallow sense. In the soul sense. It makes him think about whether he is emotionally honest. Whether he is capable of staying when depth arrives. Whether he knows the difference between clarity and fear. Whether what he calls masculinity is actually maturity, or just a well-practiced form of emotional self-protection. This kind of thinking can be exhausting, because it is not problem-solving. It is self-confrontation. A man can solve a business issue. He can solve a logistical problem. He can solve external complexity. But what does he do when the problem is that something real has entered his heart, and now his mind can no longer remain untouched by it? He cannot spreadsheet his way out of longing. He cannot strategy his way out of emotional consequence. He cannot simply be rational. if what is shaking him is the realization that he cares more than he intended, or that intimacy has touched parts of him he has kept outside his own conscious attention. So he thinks, and thinks, and thinks. He thinks late at night, between tasks, in the car, after a message, after silence, after a memory surfaces unexpectedly. This is not weakness. It is an inner system trying to metabolize meaning. The divine masculine mind does not only react to real intimacy with desire. It reacts with internal rearrangement. And rearrangement always creates friction, because the old mind structure was built to avoid certain truths. Truths like, you are more emotionally affected than you admit. You do not only want connection, you want significance. You do not only fear the wrong person, you fear the right person reaching the parts of you that have been hidden. You do not only crave peace, you also crave a love that makes peace impossible until you become more honest. These truths are destabilizing because they challenge the myth of total self-sufficiency. Many men are taught that to think deeply is fine, as long as the thinking remains abstract, strategic, useful. But when intimacy pushes thought toward tenderness, dependency, spiritual meaning, emotional truth, and the possibility of loss, the masculine mind often becomes conflicted. Part of him wants to follow the thought all the way down. Part of him wants to shut it off. This is where the inner war begins. One side says, "This matters. Do not run. Look at what this is showing you. Pay attention to why this is staying in your mind." The other side says, "You are overthinking. Stay detached. Do not make this bigger than it is. Get control back. Return to what you know." That tension is not random. It is the psyche defending an old identity while another part of the soul begins to awaken. That is why real intimacy often makes a man mentally noisier before it makes him clearer. People sometimes assume that if a man is truly moved, he will become immediately simple and direct. Sometimes he does, if he is already integrated enough. But often the first stage is not simplicity. It is disruption. Because intimacy has reached beneath his usual mental order and awakened rooms he usually keeps dim. He starts thinking about heartbreak even if nothing has ended. Thinking about loss even while the connection is alive. Thinking about what would happen if he let himself care fully. Thinking about what kind of man he would have to become if he did not want to mishandle what is now entering his life. These are not easy thoughts. They are sacred ones. Sacred because they reveal that he is no longer treating the connection as casual. Sacred because they expose how much he has to confront if he wants to remain truthful. Sacred because they begin to move him from appetite toward self-awareness, from attraction toward accountability. Consider the man who usually moves through life with impressive composure. He does not get emotionally tangled easily. He knows how to keep his center. He is thoughtful, maybe even admired for how measured he is. Then one real connection enters. And suddenly he is replaying a simple sentence in his mind for 3 days. Why? Because the sentence was not just information. It touched meaning. And meaning is what the mind cannot easily release. The divine masculine mind is deeply affected by meaning, especially when that meaning touches identity. If a woman says something that reveals she sees beyond his role, or if a moment of intimacy exposes how much he actually cares, his mind begins circling it not because he is childish, but because his internal system is trying to reconcile two realities: the man he thought he was, and the man he becomes in the presence of real intimacy. That reconciliation can take time, because often, what real intimacy makes him think about are the exact things he built his life to avoid. What if I am not as unaffected as I perform? What if I am tired of living behind the version of me that always stays in control? What if I actually want something deeper than freedom without attachment? What if my strongest relationships have not failed because women were too much, but because I was still too defended? What if the reason I cannot stop thinking is that the connection is forcing me into truths I no longer want to postpone? These thoughts do not flatter the ego. They purify it. That is why the mind resists them at first. It may try to make the connection smaller. Call it timing. Call it chemistry. Call it confusion. Call it intensity. Anything but revelation. But deep down, he often knows. He knows this is different because it will not leave him mentally untouched. It keeps returning. Not like fantasy. Like instruction. And that is the deeper function of these thoughts. They are not always there to torment him. Often they are there to educate him. To teach him where he is still fragmented. Where he still confuses safety with distance. Where he still wants love without the surrender of becoming more emotionally honest. Where he still sees introspection as a threat instead of a doorway. This is why real intimacy can be one of the greatest mental turning points in a man's life. It does not merely fill his mind with a person. It fills his mind with truth. Truth about his patterns. Truth about his fear. Truth about his longing. Truth about the kind of love he says he wants versus the kind of man he is currently prepared to be. Once those truths begin surfacing, he is no longer free to remain as unconscious as before. He may still try, but something in him has started thinking more deeply than the old identity can comfortably contain. This is the hidden gift. Because what real intimacy does to the divine masculine mind is not just create obsession or overthinking. At its highest level, it creates confrontation with depth. Depth he usually avoids. Depth that cannot be fully managed through logic. Depth that asks more of him than performance. Depth that requires him to become a man capable of inner honesty, not just outer strength. And that is why he thinks. Not because he is weak. Not because he is playing games. But because something real has entered, and his mind now has to face what his soul has already begun to recognize. He can no longer stay shallow with himself. Not completely. Not the same way. Because once intimacy has made him think about what he usually avoids, the old life starts to feel thinner. The old distractions feel less satisfying. The old certainties feel less certain. The old mask feels heavier. And in that mental unrest, something sacred begins. The beginning of a man who no longer wants only to manage his inner world. A man who begins, however tremblingly, to tell the truth about it. Chapter 4. It creates inner conflict between control and surrender. There is a battle many men never speak about. Not because it is small. Because it is too private. Too contradictory. Too exposing. Too difficult to explain in ordinary language. It is the battle between control and surrender. And when real intimacy enters the life of the divine masculine, this battle often becomes impossible to ignore. On the surface, he may still look composed, still thoughtful, still quiet, still measured, still in command of his words, his posture, his pacing, his choices. But inside, another story is unfolding. One part of him wants to move closer, to trust, to soften, to stop performing, to let himself be met, to rest in the presence of something that feels real enough to disarm him. Another part wants to pull back, to regain the upper hand, to return to mental order, to reduce the intensity, to keep some distance between himself and anything that could rearrange him too deeply. This is the conflict, not between caring and not caring. That is often the most superficial reading. The deeper conflict is between the self that longs for intimacy and the self that has been built around control. That is why real intimacy can make a man look more conflicted than clear, at least in the beginning. Because he is not only experiencing attraction, he is standing at the border of surrender. And surrender, to the masculine ego, can feel dangerous. Not because surrender is weak, but because surrender threatens old forms of safety. Safety through distance. Safety through unreadability. Safety through emotional pacing. Safety through staying one step removed from whatever could make him need, ache, grieve, or become deeply accountable to what he feels. These forms of safety are powerful because they do not look like fear from the outside. They often look like strength. The controlled man is praised. The calm man is respected. The hard-to-read man is often romanticized. The self-contained man is seen as mature. The man who never seems too affected is often treated as powerful. So he learns to trust control. He trusts the version of himself that stays steady by staying partially hidden. He trusts the habits that let him feel emotion without being overtaken by it. He trusts the mental systems that keep him organized, composed, and hard to destabilize. Then real intimacy arrives and begins asking for something his old masculinity does not know how to offer easily. Not performance. Presence. Not strategy. Honesty. Not emotional advantage. Mutuality. Not control. Surrender. This is where the tension becomes intense. Because surrender does not mean passivity. It does not mean collapse. It does not mean becoming lost in someone else. At its deepest level, surrender means allowing what is real to matter without needing to dominate its effect. And that can feel terrifying to a man whose entire internal structure has been shaped by the belief that staying in control is how he remains safe, respected, and whole. So when he feels himself being drawn towards someone in a way that bypasses the mask and enters the deeper layers of mind and heart, he begins experiencing inner division. He wants to respond. He wants to stay. He wants to know what this could become. But he also wants to protect the version of himself that does not need too much, does not reveal too much, does not surrender too much power to another person's significance. This is why he may act in ways that seem paradoxical. He comes closer, then grows distant. He opens, then goes quiet. He feels deeply, then becomes careful. He thinks about her constantly, then slows the connection down. He wants the truth, but becomes unnerved when truth starts making emotional demands on him. This is not always manipulation. Sometimes it is war. An internal war between the masculine identity he inherited and the deeper one trying to be born. The inherited masculine says, "Stay composed. Do not lose leverage. Do not let anyone become too central. Do not let emotion disrupt your structure. Do not reveal what could be used against you. Do not surrender before you are certain." The awakening masculine says, "This is real. Stop hiding behind structure. Stop pretending control is peace. Stop acting like being affected is weakness. Stop using distance to preserve an image that no longer fits your soul." These voices do not create a tidy inner life. They create friction, overthinking, restlessness, emotional hesitation, the strange phenomenon of wanting something deeply while also fearing what it will cost to fully let it in. That is why this chapter matters. Because many people think that if a man runs from intimacy, it must mean he does not feel enough. Sometimes the opposite is true. Sometimes he is feeling enough to threaten the old architecture of his mind. And when the old architecture is threatened, the first response is not always wisdom. It is often control. Control tries to restore order. Control says, "Slow it down. Keep things undefined. Do not say too much yet. Withdraw until the feeling settles. Stay strong. Stay hard to read. Do not let the connection get ahead of your ability to mentally contain it." In small ways, these impulses can sound reasonable. And sometimes caution is wise. But the deeper issue is this. Does he want discernment? Or does he want the comfort of preserving the self that never has to fully surrender to emotional truth? That is the harder question. Because control can wear the face of wisdom while quietly protecting fear. A man may say he needs time. And perhaps he does. But what kind of time? Time to understand what is real. Or time to retreat back into the identity that felt safe before intimacy touched his deeper self. A man may say he needs space. And perhaps he does. But what kind of space? Space for clarity? Or space to get back behind the wall where he no longer has to feel the pull between longing and surrender? This is what real intimacy exposes. It turns abstract concepts into living choices. He can no longer talk about trust as an idea. Now he must decide whether he can trust enough to stop controlling every layer of emotional access. He can no longer romanticize connection in theory. Now he must decide whether he can let connection ask something of him. He can no longer praise depth from a distance. Now he must decide whether he is willing to be altered by depth. That is where surrender becomes real. And surrender is never merely emotional. It is existential. Because when a man surrenders to real intimacy, he is not simply letting himself feel. He is allowing parts of his identity to loosen. The identity that equated control with dignity. The identity that equated emotional distance with strength. The identity that believed the safest man is the least reachable man. The identity that learned long ago that needing too much could lead to pain, shame, or loss of self-respect. These identities do not give way easily. That is why surrender often feels like danger first. He may feel his chest tighten, his thoughts spiral, his usual confidence lose some of its ease. He may suddenly become more aware of timing, tone, silence, possibility, rejection, expectation, responsibility. Not because intimacy is wrong, but because it is moving him from emotional management into emotional reality. And emotional reality is where the old self starts to tremble. This trembling is sacred. It does not mean he is broken. It means something false is being challenged. A man who never feels this inner conflict may still be living at the level of surface contact, where nothing truly threatens to transform him. But the man who feels pulled between control and surrender is already standing inside a deeper process. He is being asked, will you stay governed by fear disguised as structure? Or will you allow what is real to soften your grip on who you thought you had to be? That is one of the deepest questions in the divine masculine journey. Because ultimately, control wants certainty before openness. Surrender allows openness before total certainty. Control says, once I know I am safe, I will let go. Surrender says, only by letting go honestly will I discover what safety really is. This is frightening because it removes the illusion that he can remain in charge of everything while also receiving the full medicine of intimacy. He cannot. He can receive pieces of it, moments of it, the thrill of it, the stimulation of it. But he cannot receive its deepest transformation while staying entirely defended. That is why real intimacy often creates such mental and emotional turbulence. It is not simply giving him a feeling. It is inviting him into a death. The death of the controlled self as the highest masculine ideal. Not the death of discipline. Not the death of strength. Not the death of clarity. The death of the lie that says he must always remain emotionally invulnerable in order to remain masculine. This lie is old and deeply rooted. It tells him that the moment he surrenders, he becomes weak. That the moment someone matters too much, he loses power. That the moment he lets himself be truly met, he becomes dependent, exposed, less than. But real intimacy begins teaching a very different lesson. What if surrender is not weakness? What if it is the refusal to keep worshiping false strength? What if control is not always power? What if sometimes it is the prison that keeps him from becoming whole? What if the deepest masculine steadiness is not the ability to stay untouched? What if it is the ability to remain true while being deeply touched? That question can transform a man. Because once he begins to see that surrender does not mean losing himself, but revealing the self beneath performance, he becomes capable of a different kind of inner order. Not order through rigidity, order through truth. He stops asking only how to protect his structure. He begins asking whether his structure is built on reality. He stops assuming that every urge to withdraw is wisdom. He begins wondering whether some forms of withdrawal are simply fear demanding the language of discernment. He stops glorifying unreadability. He starts valuing emotional congruence. He stops making intimacy prove itself endlessly before he risks anything real. He begins understanding that some truths can only be known by those willing to surrender enough to meet them honestly. This is not reckless surrender. It is sacred surrender. The surrender of masks. The surrender of old scripts. The surrender of control as identity. The surrender of the need to preserve a version of masculinity that keeps him looking strong while quietly starving him of depth. And yes, it takes time. No man lets go all at once. No deep inner structure dissolves overnight. He may still oscillate, still feel the urge to return to control, still become quiet, cautious, guarded in moments when intimacy touches something particularly deep. But if he is truly awakening, something changes in the quality of that struggle. He no longer romanticizes the controlling self quite so easily. He begins to see what it costs. The missed closeness, the delayed honesty, the emotional fatigue, the endless management of image, the inability to rest fully in what is real. That is when surrender begins looking less like danger and more like liberation. Not liberation from responsibility, liberation from false masculinity. The divine masculine does not lose himself in this process. He finds the self that control kept hidden, the self that can love without manipulation, the self that can desire without domination, the self that can feel without collapsing, the self that can be met without turning every moment of real intimacy into a test of emotional power. That is the beauty hidden inside this inner conflict. The conflict itself is painful, but it is also evidence. Evidence that real intimacy has reached the places where true change becomes possible. Evidence that the old mind can no longer remain peacefully unchallenged. Evidence that a new form of masculinity is pressing against the shell of the old one. So yes, real intimacy creates inner conflict between control and surrender. But that conflict is not proof that something has gone wrong. It is often proof that something has finally become real enough to matter. And the man who is willing to stay inside that conflict, not to dramatize it, not to run from it, but to learn from it, begins to discover a profound truth. He was never meant to be ruled by control. He was meant to become strong enough to surrender to truth without losing his center. That is where the old masculine shakes, and the awakened masculine begins. Chapter 5. It exposes his fear of being truly known. There is a difference between being liked and being known. A man can be liked for years without ever feeling truly seen. He can be admired, desired, respected, even loved in a certain way, and still remain hidden behind the version of himself he knows how to present. He can be appreciated for his strength, valued for his calm, wanted for his presence, trusted for his stability, praised for his depth. And still, somewhere beneath all of that, another fear remains untouched. The fear of being truly known. This is one of the deepest things real intimacy does to the divine masculine mind. It pushes him beyond the surface experience of being chosen and into the far more unsettling experience of being understood. Not just understood in his beauty, understood in his contradiction, understood in his silence. understood in the places where his confidence is covering fragility, where his control is covering fear, where his distance is covering longing. And that kind of understanding can shake him more deeply than rejection ever could. Because rejection still leaves the mask intact. He can walk away and say, "She did not get me." He can tell himself the connection was wrong. He can preserve the role. He can remain protected inside the identity he already knows how to wear. But being truly known leaves him with less room to hide. Once someone sees what lives underneath the role, once someone senses the ache beneath the composure, the need beneath the restraint, the tenderness beneath the masculine discipline, then the question is no longer whether the connection is there. The question becomes whether he can bear the exposure of being seen beyond what he performs. That is where the fear begins. Many men are not as afraid of not being loved as they are of being loved too accurately. Because accurate love is dangerous. It does not only admire his strengths. It notices his evasions. It does not only celebrate his calm. It senses when his calm is really emotional distance. It does not only enjoy his mystery. It feels when mystery is being used as protection. It does not only respond to what he says. It hears what he leaves out. And that level of perception can feel both beautiful and unbearable. Beautiful, because part of every man longs to be known, longs to stop performing, longs to stop proving, longs to be met in a place deeper than image, function, or role. But unbearable, because if he is truly known, then he can no longer depend entirely on the mask to hold his world together. That is the conflict. The divine masculine often wants intimate recognition and fears it at the same time. He wants someone who understands him. But when someone actually does, he may become more cautious, not less. More inward. More alert. More mentally active. Why? Because being known threatens the old contract he has with himself. The contract that says, stay strong. Stay hard to read. Do not reveal too much. Do not let anyone get too far inside. Do not let tenderness become visible before you know it is safe. Do not let another person touch the parts of you that still feel unfinished. Then real intimacy enters and breaks that contract open. A woman may say something simple. Maybe she notices the sadness behind his stillness. Maybe she sees how much he holds in. Maybe she senses that his carefulness is not just wisdom, but fear. Maybe she tells the truth in one sentence, and suddenly he feels more exposed than if she had asked him 100 direct questions. That is because true knowing does not always come through interrogation. It comes through resonance. She does not have to force him open. She feels him. And for many men, that is the exact point where the mind becomes unsettled. Because now he is not just dealing with attraction. He is dealing with transparency. He may begin replaying small moments in his head. How she looked at him. What she noticed. What she meant. Why her words stayed with him. Why he feels strangely seen in a way he does not fully know how to receive. This is what real intimacy does. It turns being wanted into being revealed. And being revealed is a very different experience. A man may know how to handle desire. He may know how to navigate chemistry. He may know how to move through the familiar terrain of pursuit, tension, timing, attraction, emotional pacing. But being known enters a different territory. Now the issue is not whether he feels something. The issue is whether he can survive the truth that someone else now sees what he has been trying to manage privately. His fear, his softness, his emotional contradictions, his need to stay in control, his hunger to be understood, his terror that if he lets someone too close, they will discover the parts of him that do not look as strong as the rest. This fear is not always dramatic. Often it is quiet. It shows up as hesitation, as overthinking, as a need to slow things down, as a subtle withdrawal after a moment of emotional depth, as a strange inner alarm that goes off not because something is wrong, but because something is too real. That is why so many men become mentally conflicted when intimacy deepens. Not because they are always insincere. Sometimes because sincerity has finally become costly. It is one thing to say kind words. Another thing to feel seen enough that the connection begins asking who he really is. That question changes everything. Because real intimacy does not only ask whether he can love. It asks whether he can let himself be known without treating knowledge as danger. And that is difficult for a masculine identity built around self-command. The self-commanding man trusts what he can manage. He trusts what he can contain. He trusts what he can reveal in measured doses. He trusts the identity he has consciously shaped. But when someone begins seeing beyond that identity, he can feel a form of internal exposure that the mind interprets as risk. If she sees my longing, what then? If she sees how much I care, what then? If she sees that my distance is not strength but fear, what then? If she sees the child inside the man, the ache inside the calm, the vulnerability inside the self-control, what then? These are the hidden questions. And they are powerful because they often reveal an old wound. The wound of conditional worth. Many men learned early that being lovable meant being strong, useful, calm, composed, capable, unneedy, impressive. So they built themselves accordingly. They built a masculinity that could survive public life, succeed in external worlds, hold shape under pressure, and avoid the humiliation of being emotionally exposed. But intimacy does not honor these constructions automatically. It tests them. It asks, can you still be a man when someone sees your uncertainty? Can you still feel worthy when your tenderness is no longer hidden? Can you still feel masculine when the person in front of you senses how deeply they affect you? That is where the fear of being truly known becomes most active. Because now he is no longer only trying to maintain attraction. He is trying to protect identity. This is what makes the divine masculine mind so conflicted under real intimacy. He is not only asking, do I want this? He is also asking, often unconsciously, what will this do to the version of me I have worked so hard to become? That version may have brought him safety. It may have earned admiration. It may have made him feel powerful. But if real intimacy is now revealing that the version is incomplete, then he faces a painful threshold. Will he defend the incomplete self? Or will he let himself be known enough to become more whole? That is the real decision. And it is not easy. Because true knowing dissolves some illusions. The illusion that he is untouched. The illusion that he is fully self-contained. The illusion that he can stay emotionally unreadable and still become deeply intimate. The illusion that the parts of him he hides are somehow outside the realm of love. Once someone truly sees him, those illusions weaken. He may still try to retreat into them. Many do. He may go quiet, become harder to access, start controlling the rhythm again, try to get back to a place where he feels mentally protected. But something has already happened. He has been recognized, and recognition is hard to undo. He may never forget the feeling of being seen that clearly. Not because it was flattering, but because it was true. This is why real intimacy can stay in a man's mind so long. It is not always because he is obsessed with the person. Sometimes he is wrestling with the version of himself that appeared in her presence. The version that felt transparent. The version that could no longer hide behind smooth language or masculine restraint. The version that was suddenly face to face with his own need to be understood. That version is deeply human. And that humanity can frighten a man who has spent years idealizing control. Because humanity is harder to organize. It includes tenderness, confusion, need, longing, grief, the desire to rest in another person's understanding, the ache to stop being the one who always holds it together. These things are not weaknesses, but they feel risky to the old mind. So real intimacy creates a paradox. It gives him what he secretly wants, and confronts what secretly terrifies him. He wants to be known, but he fears what accurate knowing will cost. He wants to be loved beneath the mask, but he fears the collapse of the identity that mask protected. He wants someone to feel the deeper him, but he fears that if the deeper him is truly visible, he will have to stop hiding not only from her, but from himself. That is the real fear. Being truly known by another person inevitably invites self-knowledge. And self-knowledge is where the old masculine loses some of its power. Because once he sees the pattern, he cannot entirely unsee it. Once he realizes that his distance is tied to fear, he cannot keep calling it peace with the same innocence. Once he realizes that his silence is tied to self-protection, he cannot keep romanticizing it as depth so easily. Once he realizes that being understood feels frightening because it exposes how unfinished parts of him still are, he has to decide whether he wants to grow or simply retreat. This is where real intimacy becomes sacred. Not because it is comfortable, but because it reveals the truth beneath the image. And truth, once revealed, becomes a threshold. He can either become more defended, treating true knowing as a threat and retreating deeper into the identity that has always protected him. Or he can begin loosening his loyalty to that identity. Begin accepting that masculinity is not diminished by being known. That strength is not destroyed by transparency. That being understood is not emasculating. That the deepest form of power may not be remaining hidden, but becoming honest enough that hiddenness is no longer necessary. This is an enormous shift. It changes the way he thinks, the way he speaks, the way he loves, the way he receives love. Because the man who is no longer terrified of being truly known becomes capable of a very different intimacy. He becomes less performative, less defensive, less dependent on unreadability, less committed to the exhausting task of appearing untouched. He becomes more real. And that is what the divine masculine is ultimately being led toward. Not an idealized image. A real man. A real man who can be seen without collapsing. Known without disappearing. Loved without needing to dominate the terms of the love. Understood without treating understanding as threat. That does not happen all at once. It often begins with discomfort, with inner conflict, with the mental unrest of realizing that someone now sees what he was not planning to reveal. But that unrest is holy, because it marks the beginning of a new masculinity, one that no longer needs to fear true knowing as destruction, one that begins to understand that real intimacy does not weaken him by seeing through the mask. It offers him the chance to finally stop living behind it. Chapter 6. It turns desire into mental obsession. At first, he thinks it is just attraction, just chemistry, just a spark, just tension doing what tension always does. Just one more person entering his life with enough beauty, depth, mystery, or emotional pull to make things feel alive for a while. He tells himself it is manageable, because ordinary desire usually is. Ordinary desire can be contained. It can be enjoyed, paced, delayed, controlled, labeled, placed inside a familiar category. He can want someone and still remain mentally intact. He can feel drawn and still keep his center. He can admire beauty and move on. He can feel the thrill of connection without it entering the deeper layers of his thought. But then real intimacy enters, and desire changes. It stops behaving like appetite. It becomes presence. It stays with him after the moment is gone. It lingers after the messages end. It follows him into silence, into routine, into work, into late nights and small pauses and unexpected memories. And suddenly, what he thought was desire starts occupying his mind like something much deeper. This is one of the most unsettling things real intimacy does to the divine masculine mind. It turns attraction into ongoing internal presence. It takes what could have remained a fleeting emotional event and transforms it into a constant mental atmosphere. He thinks about her when he does not want to. He replays things he cannot explain. He notices details that should not matter this much. He feels her absence in spaces where she was never physically present. He starts organizing thoughts around a connection he can no longer keep in the category of simple. That is why desire begins to feel like obsession. Not always in the unhealthy, dramatic sense people imagine. Often in a quieter, more sacred, more disturbing form. A mental haunting. The kind that does not scream. It echoes. Why did she say that? Why did that moment stay with me? Why am I remembering her tone, her eyes, her stillness, her words, her silence? Why does my mind keep returning to this one connection when so many others pass through without leaving a mark? Because real intimacy does not only create attraction, it creates imprint. And imprint changes the way desire behaves. A man can desire a body and remain mostly unchanged. But when he desires someone whose presence has entered his deeper emotional and psychological space, the desire begins carrying meaning. And meaning is what makes the mind circle. He is no longer only wanting. He is processing. Processing what she awakened, what she revealed, what she exposed in him, what now feels possible, what now feels dangerous, what now feels impossible to ignore. This is why the divine masculine mind can become so intensely active after real intimacy. It is not merely fantasizing. It is trying to metabolize a reality that has become too psychologically significant to dismiss. That significance creates repetition. He revisits the same moments, replays the same exchanges, questions the same silences, searches for clarity in things that once would have passed through him lightly. Why? Because obsession at this stage is often the mind's attempt to understand what the soul already knows has become important. And importance is not easy for a defended masculine psyche. A man may know how to handle attraction, but importance threatens his structure. Because if this person has become important, then his old ways of staying untouched no longer work the same way. Now he has to face uncertainty, attachment, longing, the possibility of loss, the possibility that what he feels is not casual at all. This is the deeper truth beneath mental obsession. It is not always just, I can't stop thinking about her. Sometimes it is, I can't stop thinking about what this means about me. What does it mean that one real connection enters him more deeply than 10 superficial ones? What does it mean that he feels mentally pulled towards someone even when he is trying to remain composed? What does it mean that desire has crossed into contemplation? What does it mean that he is no longer just attracted, but rearranged? These are the unspoken questions. And they matter because the masculine mind often does not like being rearranged without permission. It prefers order, direction, containment, clear categories, manageable emotions, controlled movement. Real intimacy disrupts that. It makes the mind less linear, less certain, less able to dismiss what is happening as a temporary mood. That is why he may become obsessed with trying to define the connection. Was it real? Was it spiritual? Was it just timing? Was it chemistry? Was it projection? Why did it feel so rare? Why did it get into my head like this? Why can I not reduce it to something simpler? This search for definition is not random. It is the mind trying to restore structure after intimacy has introduced depth. Depth creates pressure. Pressure to understand. Pressure to assign meaning. pressure to regain orientation after the old internal map has stopped feeling complete. He may begin noticing how much space she occupies in his thought, how often he imagines future conversations, how often he revisits past ones, how his concentration changes, how memories surface during ordinary moments, how strongly his mind reacts to even small signs of presence or absence. All of this can make him feel unlike himself. But the deeper truth is that he is being introduced to a self he may not know well. The self that forms mental attachment. The self that longs. The self that is vulnerable to significance. The self that cannot simply move on the moment something becomes inconvenient. The self that has a soul, not just a strategy. That self can feel threatening to the old masculine identity. Because the old identity thrives on emotional control. It wants desire to stay manageable. It wants attraction to stay pleasurable, not penetrating. It wants people to remain experiences, not inner landscapes. But real intimacy makes another person become landscape. That is why the mind keeps returning. Not because he is weak. Not because he lacks discipline. Not because he is indulging fantasy for no reason. Because something in him has been imprinted by a depth he did not know how to receive lightly. And once imprint happens, the mind begins orbiting. Orbiting the memory, the possibility, the loss, the unanswered questions, the version of himself that came alive in her presence, the version of himself that now feels hard to forget. This is an important point. Sometimes he is not only obsessed with her, he is obsessed with who he became around her. More open, more affected, more transparent, more uncertain, more alive, more vulnerable, more internally awake. That can be intoxicating and terrifying, because if she became the mirror through which he glimpsed a deeper self, then losing her, or even simply being distant from her, does not only mean losing a person. It can feel like losing contact with a part of himself he had only just begun to recognize. That creates enormous mental pull. The mind keeps going back not only to the person, but to the revelation. The revelation that he is capable of more feeling than he admits, more tenderness than he performs, more longing than his masculine image comfortably allows, more inner complexity than his old life was forcing him to face. This is why mental obsession can become almost spiritual in quality. He may find that ordinary distractions do not work as well. He may stay busy and still feel the thought of her moving underneath everything. He may meet new people and still find his mind comparing, remembering, returning. He may try to reason his way out of the intensity and only realize how little logic changes the fact that something in him has already been claimed by meaning. Meaning is what obsession feeds on, not empty stimulation. Meaning. And real intimacy is saturated with meaning. A look means something. A pause means something. A sentence means something. A change in energy means something. A distance means something. That is why his mind starts scanning, replaying, interpreting. Again, this is not always pathology. Often it is his inner world struggling to integrate a connection that has crossed the line from attraction into significance. This is also why the mind can become especially loud when the connection is unclear. If intimacy is real but not fully settled, fully spoken, or fully resolved, the masculine mind may keep circling because ambiguity and significance together are mentally combustible. He feels deeply, but does not have a clear place to put what he feels. He senses something important, but does not know how to stabilize it. He longs, but also fears the implications of longing. So the mind keeps moving, trying to solve, trying to understand, trying to regain control over what now lives inside him with a life of its own. This is the hidden pain of mental obsession. It reveals that desire has become too deep to remain just desire. It is now tied to identity, possibility, vulnerability, and emotional truth. He may not say that out loud. He may still call it chemistry. He may still try to flatten it into simpler language. But inwardly, he knows. This is not simple anymore. And because it is not simple, the mind cannot release it casually. That is where the old masculine often becomes frightened. He asks, why am I giving this so much power? Why am I thinking about her this much? Why can I not just let this be what it is and move on? Why does this feel like more than attraction? The answer is not always that he is obsessed because he wants control over her. Sometimes he is obsessed because real intimacy has stripped away his old control over himself. That is a humbling truth, because now the issue is not conquest. It is consequence. The consequence of being touched deeply. The consequence of being seen. The consequence of desire becoming vulnerable, meaningful, and mentally alive. The consequence of no longer being able to hide from the fact that something in him has been awakened. And once awakened, the mind does not easily return to sleep. This is where real transformation begins, because the obsession itself becomes a teacher. It teaches him what matters, what lingers, what he cannot dismiss, what his soul recognizes as important enough to disturb his mental order. It teaches him that he is not as detached as he thought, not as unaffected as he appeared, not as free from emotional imprint as his old identity preferred to believe. And if he listens closely, it teaches him something even deeper. It teaches him that desire, when joined with real intimacy, is not asking merely to be satisfied. It is asking to be understood. What is this desire pointing to? What loneliness is it revealing? What longing is it uncovering? What truth is it forcing him to think about? What kind of man is he becoming under the pressure of this mental fixation? These are the sacred questions. Because obsession can degrade a man if he only feeds the fantasy. But it can transform a man if he follows the obsession down to the truth it is protecting. The truth may be, I am more emotionally hungry than I admitted. I am more affected by real intimacy than I expected. I do not just want beauty. I want depth. I do not just want connection. I want meaning. I do not just want her attention. I want the kind of intimacy that makes my mind, heart, and soul stop lying to each other. That is profound. And once he sees that, the obsession begins to shift. It is no longer only fixation. It becomes revelation. A revelation that his mind was not being haunted for nothing. It was being forced to confront what it usually avoids. Need, tenderness, attachment, meaning, the cost of real intimacy. The collapse of shallow desire as a sufficient explanation for what is happening. This is what Chapter 6 is really about. Real intimacy turns desire into mental obsession because it turns desire into significance. It makes the masculine mind circle not around pleasure alone, but around truth, longing, vulnerability, and the possibility of a different life. And that circling, though painful, is often the first sign that something in him has been touched deeply enough that he can no longer keep calling it just attraction and remain honest. He is thinking because he is being changed. He is circling because something sacred has entered. And whether he learns from it or runs from it, he will never again be able to say that real intimacy left his mind untouched. Chapter 7. It forces him to face emotional truth. There are truths a man can avoid for years, not because they are hidden, but because nothing has yet become intimate enough to force them into the light. He can avoid them through discipline, through work, through movement, through attraction, through routine, through carefully chosen words, through the version of masculinity that knows how to function without fully feeling. He can live an entire life this way on the surface. He can be respected, desired, capable, even spiritually curious. And still, he can remain a stranger to some of his deepest emotional truths. Then real intimacy enters. And suddenly, what he has managed to keep buried no longer stays buried. That is one of the most powerful things real intimacy does to the divine masculine mind. It does not allow him to keep living on half-truths. It does not let him hide indefinitely behind polished language, good intentions, controlled distance, or the old story that he is simply careful, private, or not ready. Real intimacy begins asking a different question. What is actually true inside you? Not what sounds wise. Not what looks strong. Not what protects your image. What is true? That question is far more disruptive than most people realize. Because many men do not suffer only from confusion. They suffer from the emotional cost of not wanting to name the truth. The truth that they care more than they admit. The truth that they are afraid of what intimacy will require. The truth that they use space not only for clarity, but sometimes for escape. The truth that their silence is not always peace. The truth that what they call discernment can sometimes be fear wearing dignified clothes. These truths do not always feel noble when they surface. They feel exposing. And this is why real intimacy is so mentally confronting. It does not only make him emotional. It makes him honest, or at least it begins pressuring him toward honesty. It corners him inside his own inner contradictions until he can no longer pretend not to see them. A man may say he needs space, and perhaps sometimes he truly does. But real intimacy begins asking, space for what? To think clearly? Or to regain distance from feelings that have become too real? A man may say he is confused, and perhaps he is. But intimacy asks, confused about what? About the connection? Or about the fact that the connection has exposed a self you were not ready to meet? A man may say he is protecting his peace. And perhaps peace matters. But intimacy asks, is it peace? Or is it the comfort of returning to a version of yourself that does not have to answer to emotional truth? This is how intimacy forces emotional truth to the surface. Not by accusing, by revealing. It reveals where his words and his inner world do not fully match. It reveals where he wants closeness, but fears transparency. It reveals where he craves a sacred connection, but still resists the death of the old self that sacred connection requires. This is what makes the divine masculine mind so restless under real intimacy. He is no longer merely dealing with feelings. He is dealing with emotional evidence. Evidence that he is affected. Evidence that he is afraid. Evidence that he cannot remain untouched and still be honest. Evidence that the connection is not only interesting, but personally revealing. And emotional evidence is hard to argue with. He may try, of course. He may use logic, timing, circumstances, complexity, the language of self-protection, the language of masculine restraint, the language of, I just need to think. But deep down, real intimacy keeps pressing on the same point. What is the truth beneath all of that? This is why intimacy can make him mentally noisy. He starts replaying what he said. Not just because he is overthinking, but because he can feel where he was not fully truthful. He starts analyzing his reactions. Not just because he is curious, but because he senses they reveal more than he wants to admit. He starts noticing the gap between what he claims and what he does. That gap matters, because it is inside that gap that emotional truth lives. A man may claim he wants depth, but when depth appears, he becomes evasive. He may claim he values honesty, but when honesty would expose his vulnerability, he delays. He may claim he wants a real connection, but when the connection becomes emotionally costly, he starts reaching for distance. This does not automatically make him false. It makes him divided. And real intimacy hates division. Not in a cruel way. in a sacred way. It keeps pressing until the split becomes visible. The split between the man who longs and the man who retreats. The man who knows and the man who delays. The man who wants love and the man who still worships control. The man who senses truth and the man who keeps editing it before he speaks. This is why real intimacy often feels like pressure inside the mind. It is applying force to the places where he is least integrated. It is saying, stop calling this simple when it is clearly not. Stop pretending you feel nothing when your mind is full of the evidence that you do. Stop acting as if your hesitation is neutral when it is shaping another person's experience too. Stop hiding behind ambiguity when you already know more than you are admitting. That is emotional truth. It is not always dramatic. Often it is painfully simple. I care. I am afraid. I do not know how to hold this. I want closeness and fear it. I am more moved than I look. I am using distance to manage feelings I do not yet know how to honor honestly. Those kinds of truths are difficult for the old masculine, because the old masculine was trained to stay in control of appearance. To say enough, but not too much. To reveal enough, but not enough to lose leverage. To feel enough to remain human, but not enough to become emotionally transparent. Real intimacy breaks that arrangement. And once broken, the mind starts losing its old confidence in half-truths. That is why he may become quieter. Not because there is nothing inside, because there is too much. Too much that now feels morally significant. Too much that now asks for clarity. Too much that now refuses to remain conveniently unnamed. This is where the phrase, "I need space," can carry two very different meanings. In one sense, it can be mature. A man stepping back to understand himself honestly. In another sense, it can be fear. A man stepping back because the truth is too strong to remain hidden and too frightening to speak plainly. Real intimacy forces him to know which one it is. That is why the mind becomes such a battleground at this stage. Because he is not only deciding what to do about the connection, he is deciding what to do about the truth the connection has exposed. Will he tell it? Or will he manage it? Will he honor it? Or reduce it? Will he let it refine him? Or retreat until he can once again feel emotionally organized without actually becoming more honest? These are sacred choices. Because emotional truth is not only about confession. It is about alignment. It is about whether his inner world and outer behavior are beginning to belong to the same man. A divided man feels one thing, says another, does a third, and then tells himself a fourth story to explain it. Real intimacy starts making that impossible to sustain without pain. That pain is not punishment. It is consequence. The consequence of being known by something real. The consequence of no longer being able to live entirely inside edited versions of selfhood. The consequence of realizing that emotional immaturity cannot be permanently disguised as masculine caution. This is why some men pull away right before they awaken. Not because the feeling disappeared, because the truth became undeniable. And undeniable truth is terrifying to the ego. Because the ego can negotiate with uncertainty. It can bargain with complexity. It can hide in vagueness. But once the truth is clear, once a man knows in himself that he is afraid, that he cares, that he is resisting, that he is using control to avoid surrender, he has less room to pretend. Now he must choose. That is where awakening becomes possible. Not when everything feels calm, but when he can no longer lie to himself comfortably. That is the deeper meaning of this chapter. Real intimacy forces him to face emotional truth by removing the comfort of partial awareness. It makes him see what he feels, what he fears, what he avoids, and how much of his mental life has been built around not having to say, with clean honesty, "This matters to me." And once he says that, even inwardly, everything begins to change. Because now the connection is no longer just emotional. It is ethical. Now the issue is not only whether he feels drawn. It is whether he will act in truth. That is a much harder question. And it is why the divine masculine mind often becomes so intense at this stage. He is standing between two worlds. One world is familiar. The world of control, distance, edited truth, emotional self-protection. The other world is more real. The world where he admits what this has awakened. The world where he stops romanticizing confusion. The world where he becomes responsible for the energy he creates, the silence he uses, the closeness he invites, and the truth he can no longer honestly deny. That threshold is not easy to cross. But it is holy. Because the man who begins facing emotional truth stops being merely interesting. He starts becoming trustworthy. He stops hiding behind the appearance of depth. He begins building actual depth. He stops using his inner conflict as a reason to remain indefinite. He begins understanding that real masculinity is not the ability to avoid emotional truth. It is the courage to face it without abandoning himself or someone else in the process. And that courage changes him. It changes the way he thinks, the way he pauses, the way he speaks, the way he handles desire, the way he interprets silence, the way he understands vulnerability, the way he honors the impact intimacy has had on him. No longer as an inconvenience, but as revelation. That is what real intimacy is doing here. It is not trying to embarrass him. It is trying to bring him into alignment with what is real. Because a man cannot become divine while living in emotional half-truths. He cannot become whole while saying space when he means fear. He cannot become clear while saying confused, when he already knows the connection matters. He cannot become trustworthy while using silence to avoid what truth is asking of him. Eventually, he must stand before the inner facts of his own soul. I feel this. I fear this. I want this. I resist this. I am affected. I am not as detached as I pretended. I have been trying to manage what actually needs to be faced. That is emotional truth. And once the divine masculine mind begins telling it, even tremblingly, the old version of him starts to weaken. The version built on edited selfhood, on polished distance, on emotional postponement. In its place, another man begins to emerge. A man who may still be afraid, but no longer worships fear. A man who may still need time, but no longer uses time to keep truth buried. A man who may still be learning, but is finally willing to learn in the light instead of from behind the mask. That is what this chapter is really about. Real intimacy forces him to face emotional truth, and emotional truth is the doorway through which the old masculine begins to die, and the awakened masculine begins to speak. Chapter 8. It can make him pull away before he wakes up. One of the most misunderstood things about real intimacy is this. Sometimes it does not make the divine masculine come closer first. Sometimes it makes him pull away. Not because the feeling is weak. Not because the connection is false. Not because nothing meaningful happened. But because real intimacy can shake a man so deeply that his first response is not surrender. It is retreat. This is the paradox many people do not understand. They assume that if something is real, it will create immediate clarity, immediate movement, immediate honesty, immediate emotional openness. Sometimes it does. But many times, real intimacy does something more disruptive before it does anything beautiful. It confronts a man with a level of inner exposure he does not yet know how to hold. And when that happens, pulling away can become the nervous system's attempt to survive what the soul has not yet learned how to integrate. This does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks subtle. A slower reply. A little more distance. A shift in tone. a sudden need for space, a strange quietness after closeness, a hesitation that did not exist before things became emotionally real. From the outside, it can look like disinterest, like confusion, like mixed signals, like a man changing his mind. Sometimes people call it fear of intimacy, and that is partly true. But the deeper truth is even more precise. Real intimacy can make him pull away because it reaches him before he is ready to live honestly with what it reveals. That distinction matters. A man may feel something profound, but still lack the internal structure to stay present with it. He may recognize the depth of the connection, but not yet know how to remain inside that depth without trying to regain control. He may care deeply and still retreat, because caring has now activated all the places in him that are unfinished. That is why withdrawal can happen right after emotional closeness grows stronger. It is not always that intimacy failed. Sometimes intimacy succeeded too well. It reached the deeper chambers. It touched the hidden ache. It stirred the old fear. It exposed how much this matters. And now, for the first time, he feels emotionally unguarded in a way that does not fit the masculine identity he has been using to stay steady. So he pulls back. Again, not always as a strategy. Often as a reflex to restore order, a reflex to quiet the inner noise, a reflex to return to the familiar version of himself, the one who does not feel this affected, this transparent, this vulnerable, this mentally occupied by another person's presence. This is why retreat can happen right when things start becoming real. The mask is under pressure. The mind is overstimulated by meaning. The heart is more open than usual. The nervous system senses risk. And the old masculine pattern says, step back before this goes further. Further into what? Further into need. Further into truth. Further into emotional visibility. Further into responsibility. Further into the death of an identity built on remaining partly unreachable. That is what makes the retreat so significant. He is not just pulling away from a person. He is often pulling away from the version of himself that emerged in her presence. The version that cared more than he expected. The version that felt mentally occupied. The version that could no longer hide behind emotional neutrality. The version that wanted to stay, but also felt afraid of what staying would cost. This creates a very particular kind of internal pain. Because one part of him knows the closeness is real. Another part is trying to reduce the intensity before it dismantles too much too quickly. That is the hidden logic of withdrawal. He tells himself he needs space. And maybe in a surface sense he does. But what kind of space? Often, space is not only about the other person. It is about the shock of his own interior. He needs distance from how deeply he is thinking. Distance from how much he now feels. Distance from the truth that the connection has entered him more than he is ready to admit. Distance from the possibility that if he keeps moving forward, he will not be able to return to the safer, older version of himself so easily. That is why this chapter is so important. Because many people interpret masculine withdrawal only in moral or relational terms. He is uninterested. He is immature. He is avoiding. He is playing games. Sometimes those things are true in part. But many times, there is a more psychologically and spiritually serious process happening. He is experiencing inner disruption faster than he is experiencing inner integration. And when disruption outruns integration, retreat becomes tempting. A man may genuinely want intimacy. But if intimacy starts dissolving his old defenses before he has learned how to live without them, he may instinctively step back. Not because the connection means nothing, because it means too much too soon for the self he still is. This is not an excuse. It is a truth. And truth matters, because without truth, Everything gets flattened into simple stories that do not actually explain what is happening in the masculine mind. Real intimacy can make him pull away because it overwhelms the structure he uses to feel powerful. He can manage attraction. He can manage banter. He can manage light emotional exchange. He can manage surface closeness while staying inwardly organized. But when intimacy becomes soulful, when it begins touching identity, memory, fear, longing, and vulnerability all at once, the masculine mind may lose its smoothness. He starts feeling too much, thinking too much, noticing too much, caring too much. And that too much can feel dangerous to a man trained to equate masculinity with control. So he does what he has always done when too much rises. He creates distance. Distance from the person. Distance from the feeling. Distance from the mirror. Distance from the questions he is not ready to answer. This is why some of the deepest connections are followed by silence. Not because nothing happened. Because something happened that the old self could not process cleanly. He may not even understand his own withdrawal fully. He may call it confusion, timing, pressure, intensity, the need to think. And again, part of that may be true. But underneath all those explanations is often a far more vulnerable reality. He is trying to buy time between revelation and transformation. Time to decide whether he will become the man this intimacy is asking for. Time to decide whether he can stop hiding behind caution. Time to decide whether the old form of safety is worth more to him than the new form of truth opening in front of him. That is why pulling away is not always the end of the story. Sometimes it is the pause before awakening. A painful pause. A costly pause. One that may wound others if he handles it without integrity. But still a pause. Because retreat can become the space in which a man finally hears what intimacy has been saying all along. You are affected. You are afraid. You are using distance to manage meaning. You cannot keep calling this simple. You cannot keep pretending this has not touched your soul. You cannot keep standing at the edge of something real forever and remain unchanged. These are not comfortable realizations. That is why, at first, the mind resists them. The mind says, slow down, pull back, get perspective, reclaim your center. Do not let this become bigger than you can handle. But what if the point is that he was never meant to handle real intimacy the same way he handled everything else? What if he was meant to be altered by it? That is the deeper question hidden inside withdrawal. Because the old masculine wants to handle. The awakening masculine begins to understand that some things are not meant to be controlled, but consecrated. Real intimacy is one of those things. It is not a project to manage. Not a feeling to flatten. Not a situation to outthink. It is an encounter with truth. And truth does not always make a man step forward immediately. Sometimes it first makes him step back, so he can realize how much of his movement has always been governed by fear. This is why withdrawal can become a sacred symptom. Not sacred because silence is automatically noble. Not sacred because distance is always wise. But sacred because it can reveal exactly where the man still lives under the authority of self-protection. It reveals what he does when he is touched deeply. What he does when he loses emotional advantage. What he does when closeness stops flattering the ego and starts confronting the soul. Does he stay? Does he speak? Does he vanish? Does he become vague? Does he try to make the connection smaller, so he does not have to grow larger? These questions matter. Because how he pulls away reveals just as much as how he comes close. If he withdraws with honesty, he is already moving toward awakening. If he withdraws with denial, he is still defending the old self. If he withdraws and begins reflecting, the space may become transformative. If he withdraws and uses distance to escape all truth, the old cycle continues. That is the difference between retreat as fear and retreat as threshold. One leads back into sleep. The other can lead into consciousness. The divine masculine often awakens in that exact tension. He pulls away. Then he begins to feel the cost of pulling away. The silence gets louder. The absence reveals value. The distance does not restore peace as completely as he expected. The old identity starts feeling thinner. The mind keeps returning. The heart remains stirred. The questions do not disappear. And slowly, he begins realizing that retreat did not solve the real problem. Because the real problem was never simply the other person. It was the truth the other person awakened in him. You can step away from a person. You cannot so easily step away from what was revealed through them. That is why real intimacy can make him pull away before he wakes up. Because retreat is sometimes the last defense of a masculine identity that senses its old structure is no longer enough. But if the connection was real, if the intimacy truly touched his soul, then the retreat itself becomes part of the awakening. He starts seeing the pattern, seeing how quickly he uses distance, seeing how often control disguises itself as wisdom, seeing how much of his masculinity has depended on staying just far enough away from emotional truth that he never has to be fully changed by it. That seeing is painful, but it is holy, because once he sees it, the old pattern loses some of its innocence. He may still pull away, but now he knows what he is doing, and knowing is where awakening begins. He can no longer tell himself that the retreat means nothing. He can no longer call all distance discernment. He can no longer keep pretending that the connection is small if his whole inner world keeps testifying otherwise. This is the beginning of inner honesty. The beginning of a man who starts understanding that closeness did not scare him because it was wrong. It scared him because it was real enough to ask for surrender. And surrender is what the old masculine fears most. Not because surrender destroys him, because it ends his relationship with false power. False power says, stay unreachable, stay vague, stay in control, stay protected. Real power says, tell the truth, remain present, honor what is real, become capable of carrying what touches you. That is the shift. And it often begins right here, in the uncomfortable chapter where he pulls away before he wakes up. Because the retreat is not always proof that he feels nothing. Sometimes it is proof that he feels enough to threaten the old self. Enough to unsettle the mind. Enough to expose the pattern. Enough to reveal that he cannot keep asking for soul-deep intimacy while worshiping emotional distance. And if he listens, really listens, the retreat itself becomes a teacher. It teaches him that control is not peace. That space cannot replace honesty forever. That silence does not make truth disappear. That pulling away may buy time, but it cannot erase revelation. Sooner or later, he must face what the intimacy showed him. That he cares. That he fears. That he wants. That he resists. That he is being asked to become more honest than the old self knows how to be. This is why the chapter matters so much. Because many men do not awaken despite the retreat. They awaken through finally understanding why they retreated in the first place. And once that understanding lands, the old masculine begins to weaken. The one who thought distance was dignity. The one who thought silence was mastery. The one who thought staying emotionally difficult to reach was the safest way to remain strong. In his place, another man begins to emerge. A man who sees the retreat and names it. A man who understands that real intimacy did not make him weak. It revealed where he was still afraid. A man who begins, however slowly, to choose truth over the reflex to disappear. That is how he wakes. Not because he never pulled away, but because he finally stopped lying about why he did. Chapter 9. What happens when he stops running? There comes a moment when running no longer gives him what it used to. At first, distance may have felt powerful. Silence may have felt protective. Withdrawal may have felt like clarity. Control may have felt like peace. But after enough disruption, enough inner conflict, enough nights spent replaying what he tried to outrun, something begins to change. He starts realizing that he is not actually escaping the intimacy. He is carrying it with him. He carries it into silence, into work, into routine, into new conversations that somehow feel thinner than they used to, into the strange emptiness that follows every attempt to regain the old version of himself. And that is where a deeper turning point begins. Not when he feels nothing, not when the connection disappears from memory, but when he understands that running is no longer solving the real problem. Because the real problem was never only the intensity. It was the truth the intensity revealed. This is the moment where the divine masculine begins to change in a more serious way. When he stops running, the mind that was once scattered begins to reorganize. Not immediately, not perfectly, but unmistakably. Something in him becomes quieter, not because the feeling is gone, but because he has stopped fighting the fact that it exists. That matters. A man who is running is at war with his own inner reality. He is not just moving away from a person. He is resisting what that person awakened in him. His vulnerability, his tenderness, his longing, his fear of being known, his fear of losing control, his hunger for something deeper than the life he was living before. As long as he is resisting those things, the mind stays noisy. Everything feels unresolved. Thoughts circle. Emotions spike and crash. Clarity comes and goes. But when he stops running, something new happens. He starts listening. He listens to what the connection exposed. He listens to what his fear was trying to protect. He listens to the part of himself that knew all along that this was not just chemistry, not just timing, not just emotional intensity. It was revelation. And revelation always asks for a response. That is why stopping the run changes everything. Because now he is no longer asking, how do I get away from this feeling? He is asking, what is this feeling trying to show me? That question is sacred. It moves him from avoidance into awareness, from reaction into reflection, from emotional chaos into emotional truth. The old masculine runs to preserve identity. The awakening masculine begins to stay long enough to examine it. He starts seeing how much of his life has been built around not being reached too deeply. How often he called distance maturity. How often he trusted control more than truth. How often he wanted intimacy in theory, but retreated the moment intimacy began asking for actual surrender. This is the beginning of mental restructuring. Because the divine masculine mind cannot awaken while it is still serving the mask. It has to begin serving reality. Reality says, you cared more than you admitted. You were more shaken than you showed. You used distance because closeness was asking something of you. You called it confusion because naming the truth would have changed your life. These realizations are not comfortable. But once a man stops running, he becomes more capable of holding discomfort without needing to escape it immediately. That is one of the greatest signs of awakening. He becomes able to stay with what is real. Stay with the longing without turning it into panic. Stay with the fear without letting fear become his ruler. Stay with the grief without calling grief weakness. Stay with the connection's meaning without needing to reduce it just because it is emotionally expensive. This staying builds a different kind of masculine strength. Not the old strength of appearing unaffected. A deeper strength. The strength to be affected and remain honest. The strength to feel and not disappear. The strength to let the mind move from obsession into understanding. The strength to let intimacy become teacher instead of threat. This is where his inner world starts becoming clearer. He no longer thinks in the same frantic circles. Not because the person matters less, because the truth matters more now. Before, his mind may have been full of questions like, why is this happening to me? Why can't I stop thinking about her? Why did this affect me so much? Why do I want to run and come closer at the same time? Now the questions become more mature. What in me was so afraid of being seen? Why did I trust distance more than honesty? What kind of man do I become when something sacred enters my life? What old version of masculinity am I being asked to outgrow? These questions do not create instant relief. They create transformation. And transformation is slower than intensity, but deeper. A man who stops running begins to realize that intimacy was not there to embarrass him. It was there to reveal him. It revealed how unfinished parts of him still were. How much emotional truth he had avoided. How much of his identity depended on never being too vulnerable, too readable, too affected. That revelation can humble him. And humility is one of the turning keys in masculine awakening. Because once he is humble, he stops trying to win against the experience. He stops trying to make the connection smaller than it was. He stops trying to preserve pride by pretending that nothing sacred happened. Instead, he becomes teachable. He begins to let the experience shape him. That shaping changes the mind first. He becomes less attracted to vague self-protection, less impressed by his own silence, less likely to romanticize withdrawal, less comfortable with half-truths. He begins craving congruence. He wants his inner world and outer behavior to belong to the same man. He wants his words and energy to match. He wants his desires and discipline to live in the same body. He wants to stop being split between the part of him that longs for love and the part of him that sabotages it the moment it becomes real. This is a major shift. Because once a man wants congruence more than control, awakening has already begun in earnest. Now he becomes capable of a different kind of thought. Not thought that circles endlessly. Thought that builds. He begins asking, how do I become trustworthy with what I feel? How do I stop using distance as a reflex? How do I honor intimacy instead of merely reacting to it? How do I build a self that no longer needs the old mask to survive closeness? These are builders' questions, not runners' questions. And that is exactly what changes when he stops running. He moves from defense into construction. He starts constructing a stronger inner life, a cleaner inner life, a life less dependent on emotional leverage and more rooted in truth. That affects everything. His speech changes. He becomes more careful with his ambiguity, more aware of what silence does, more willing to admit when fear is present, more honest about when he needs time and why. His emotional world changes. He becomes less frantic under vulnerability, less ashamed of tenderness, less likely to confuse emotional impact with weakness, more able to let feelings inform him without needing to dominate or suppress them. His spiritual life changes too, because now intimacy is no longer just romantic or psychological. It becomes initiatory. He begins understanding that some connections enter his life to expose what still needs to die. Not always the relationship. Sometimes the false self. The self that believed masculinity meant unreadability. The self that believed safety meant staying half-hidden. The self that wanted sacred love without sacred accountability. When he stops running, he starts seeing that clearly. And once he sees clearly, he cannot easily go back to the old innocence. He may still struggle, still hesitate, still have moments when the old instinct to withdraw rises. But now there is awareness, and awareness changes the whole process. Before, he ran unconsciously. Now if he runs, he knows what he is doing. He knows he is not escaping her only. He is escaping what she revealed. That knowledge makes repetition harder. Because repetition no longer feels clean. It feels costly. He begins to feel the cost of old patterns. The loneliness inside distance. The emptiness inside vague control. The spiritual fatigue of keeping himself divided. This is why stopping the run is not just romantic progress. It is inner maturation. He becomes a man who can tolerate the truth of his own heart. And that is rare. He no longer needs to flatten every deep experience into something mentally safe. He becomes willing to say, yes, this touched me. Yes, I was afraid. Yes, I wanted to retreat. Yes, this revealed parts of me I did not want to face. Yes, I am being asked to become more honest than I have been. That kind of honesty makes a man dangerous to illusion. He stops needing to be the man who always seems unaffected. He starts becoming the man who can remain grounded while deeply affected. That is a different level of strength. Not performance. Presence. Not emotional armor. Emotional integrity. Not escape. Stewardship. He learns to steward what intimacy awakens instead of trying to outrun it. To steward desire. To steward grief. To steward tenderness. To steward the truth that another person's presence can expose his soul in ways that demand a different kind of life from him. And once he begins stewarding instead of running, his mind changes profoundly. It grows quieter, clearer, more faithful to what is real, less addicted to control, less split between what it knows and what it says. This is when the divine masculine begins to feel internally reordered. Not because the path becomes easy, because the war inside him begins to lose some of its old confusion. He now knows what the conflict was about. He was not simply confused about a woman. He was being confronted by his own becoming. And that is the deeper miracle of this chapter. When he stops running, he does not merely return to the connection. He returns to himself. Not the defended self. Not the managed self. The deeper self. The one capable of truth. The one capable of reverence. The one capable of staying present in intimacy without interpreting every deep feeling as danger. That self has always been there. But it often remains buried beneath fear, habit, image, and old masculine conditioning. Real intimacy uncovers it. Running delays it. But stopping the run allows it to breathe. And once it begins to breathe, the man changes. He becomes less interested in protecting the mask. More interested in living unmasked. Less interested in preserving emotional power. More interested in becoming emotionally honest. Less interested in control for its own sake. More interested in the kind of strength that can tell the truth and remain standing. That is what happens when he stops running. He does not become weak. He becomes real. He does not lose himself. He loses the self he used to hide behind. He does not stop being masculine. He begins embodying a masculinity deep enough to hold intimacy, without fleeing from the parts of him intimacy was sent to awaken. And that is where the next level begins. Not at the moment of the trigger alone, but at the moment he finally turns around, faces what it revealed, and says in his own soul, I will not keep running from the truth of what this came to change in me. Chapter 10. Real intimacy does not destroy him, it reveals him. In the end, the deepest transformation does not happen because he finally finds the perfect words. It happens because he can no longer hide from what real intimacy has shown him. That is the final turning point in the divine masculine mind. Not when he stops feeling. Not when he becomes cold again. Not when he finds a way to explain the connection without changing because of it. But when he understands that real intimacy was never sent to ruin his peace. It was sent to expose the false version of peace he had been living inside. The peace built on distance. The peace built on emotional control. The peace built on staying hard to read. The peace built on never letting anyone close enough to touch the deepest parts of him. That peace was never true peace. It was managed safety. And real intimacy breaks managed safety. It enters the mind like a question that will not go away. It enters the heart like a truth that will not stay buried. It enters the soul like a light that makes old hiding places impossible to enjoy in the same way. That is why the experience feels so intense. Because real intimacy is not just emotional closeness. It is revelation. It reveals the gap between the man he performs and the man he really is. It reveals the fear beneath the calm, the longing beneath the distance, the tenderness beneath the discipline, the hunger beneath the control, the deeper self beneath the mask. And once those things are revealed, he has a choice. He can spend the rest of his life trying to rebuild the old structure. Or he can let the structure fall and become someone truer. That is the true meaning of awakening. The divine masculine does not awaken because he avoids disruption. He awakens because disruption finally teaches him what his old life could not. It teaches him that being unaffected is not the same as being strong. That silence is not always wisdom. That distance is not always clarity. That control is not always peace. That desire is not always simple. That vulnerability is not weakness. That real intimacy is not a threat to masculinity. It is a mirror powerful enough to purify it. And when a man truly understands that, his mind begins to change in a deeper way. He stops glorifying confusion. He stops romanticizing his own withdrawal. He stops using emotional complexity as a place to hide. He stops pretending that what shook him meant nothing. He stops asking only how to protect himself and begins asking how to become more honest, more grounded, more worthy of what intimacy revealed. That is when the divine masculine becomes different. Not merely more emotional, more integrated. He becomes a man who can sit with truth. A man who can feel deeply without disappearing. A man who can be seen without collapsing into shame. A man who can love without needing to dominate. A man who can hold tenderness without calling it weakness. A man who no longer needs the old mask because he has started building a stronger self beneath it. This is why real intimacy is sacred. It does not come only to comfort him. It comes to confront him, to rearrange him, to awaken parts of him that his old life kept buried, to invite him into a masculinity that is no longer built on performance, but on presence, no longer built on control, but on truth, no longer built on distance, but on inner steadiness. And maybe that is the final mystery. The thing he feared would undo him was actually the thing that came to reveal him. The thing that made him overthink, pull back, question everything, and feel more exposed than ever before was also the thing that showed him the doorway to a more honest self. So no, real intimacy does not destroy him. It destroys the illusion that he is strongest when he is unreachable, the illusion that he is safest when he reveals nothing, the illusion that he can stand close to something sacred and remain unchanged. The illusion that the mind can stay divided forever without the soul eventually crying out for more. Real intimacy breaks those illusions so that something more real can rise. A man who no longer runs from his own heart. A man who no longer calls fear wisdom. A man who no longer hides behind the language of caution when truth is asking for courage. A man who finally understands that being transformed by love is not humiliation. It is initiation. And that is the real ending of this journey. Not that he has all the answers. Not that every wound is gone. Not that every connection returns. But that he is no longer the same man who first encountered intimacy with only control, distance, and self-protection. Now he knows. He knows what real intimacy can awaken. He knows what it exposes. He knows what it costs to keep running. He knows that the mind cannot be touched this deeply without being asked to evolve. And once he knows that, the old life becomes too small. He may still tremble, still take time, still walk the path imperfectly. But he is awake now in a way he was not before. And the awakened masculine can never again fully belong to the comfort of emotional sleep. So let this be the truth you remember. If real intimacy shook him, it was not meaningless. If it unsettled his mind, it was not shallow. If it exposed his contradictions, it was not there to shame him. If it made him pull back before he woke up, it was not proof that nothing was real. Sometimes the deepest intimacy enters a man's life not to flatter who he has been, but to call him into who he is capable of becoming. It reveals the places where he is still divided. It reveals the places where he is still afraid. It reveals the places where love is trying to make him more truthful, more grounded, more emotionally alive. And that is not destruction. That is sacred transformation. Because the divine masculine is not the man who never gets shaken. He is the man who lets the shaking become truth. If this video spoke to you, comment "Real intimacy reveals him" below. Tell me which chapter hit you the deepest, and share this video with someone who needs this message right now. Subscribe for more content on divine masculine awakening, sacred intimacy, emotional truth, and conscious love.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.